by Blue Rascal. Chapter 2. Being Seen. The clock read 10:20, and Logan decided that it would be safe enough now to go into the kitchen and grab some snacks before mid-morning break occurred. After discovering 3 empty cereal bowls, an empty tin of biscuits, and then an empty cake wrapper, he decided to just make himself some coffee from the percolator. Why did it take so long for the coffee to come out? It was already made up this morning. The mutant tapped his fingers against the worktop and then unsheathed his adamantium claws, hoping to terrify the machine into working faster. Rogue burst into the room and went into the far cupboard where she removed a hidden Twinkie. She looked at him icily. "What are you staring at?" She then left the room. Logan looked at his coffee and wondered if he had just seen Rogue dressed as a white rabbit. Then he looked up again. He saw Scott enter in tight blue jeans, a tight white t-shirt, and a leather bomber jacket. His hair was gelled back into a bad quiff. Cyclops entered a different cupboard and removed a cereal bar from a secret stash before looking at Logan and frowning. "Something wrong, Wolverine?" "Why would you say that?" Logan asked gruffly, wondering if Scott had suffered some terminal head trauma. "Your claws are out. Pretty weird at this time of day." He shrugged and left the room, leaving Logan to sniff his coffee again. Very slowly, the mutant poured it down the sink. Knit 1, purl 2, up, over, and across, under, through, and off. Aurora frowned and paused to count her stitches, all present and accounted for. Next, she flattened the knitting out, noting that the pattern seemed in working order. So what was bothering her with the wool? Meows caught her attention, and as slowly as she dared, the Weather Witch lowered her knitting and found the length of string with her eyes. By her feet, Kurt was pawing at the ball and rolling around with it. "Meow." He looked at her quizzically. "Hello, little cat, and what are you called?" Aurora grinned and decided to play along with whatever Kurt was up to. She burst out laughing when he rolled onto his back and tossed the wool in the air, dropping it and chasing after the ball. The swatting and accompanying hisses made her fall off the chair, and she was then laughing as Kurt decided to use her as an impromptu pillow. Purr. She laughed and pushed him off. "Well, little cat, you are a cute little fellow. So then what shall I call you?" The blue mutant shrugged and decided to curl up on the cushion she had been using moments before. "I know. Let's call you Chip." She ruffled his hair and then removed her knitting from anywhere near him. After a few moments, she looked back over to spot an empty chair. She figured that he must have grown bored with his little game. Kitty looked carefully left, then right, before sneaking down the hall. She paused at the next turning and carefully looked around the corner. Nothing seemed out of place and no one seemed to be anywhere near her. "Meow." Since when had they gotten a cat? Kitty turned around and stared at Kurt, who was swaggering on his fours down the hall. She continued to stare at him when he quite calmly rubbed up against her legs with a realistic purr that reminded her of a car engine. Kurt, I am not, going on all fours for a stupid game." "Meow." "Huh. Hello, you can, talk, you know?" Kurt hit his head. "Meow." She twinged. "I'm not supposed to... Oh. Woof." There was a moment of silence. Kurt hissed and puffed his fur up to nearly double his size, then took off like a rocket onto the ceiling. He hissed vehemently again. "Come on, I can't Meow." She growled and marched off, not caring that anyone she passed paused to stare at her. Black was definitely not her color, and it had probably been a bad idea to do her nose black after all. "Spare any change, pal?" Kitty stopped in her tracks and looked over to Jean. The redhead had on a pair of oversized denims and an oversized jacket. There was a distinct grungy feel about her, and Kitty took a step back. "Woof!" "Oh, you're not a burglar." Jean shook her head. The straggly red hair gleamed unhealthily. "So you're a dog. Rose a rabbit. You should be chasing her." "Woof!" Kitty pointed to her mouth. "Woof!" Jean frowned. "Of course, dogs can't talk. Oh well, I doubt you can spare any change anyway." Kitty tapped her pockets and shrugged. With a smirk, she barked and walked away. Going through such humiliation was worth just one glimpse of Jean as a tramp. Now, how would she explain a dog taking photographs? The silence of the library was soothing for Charles Xavier. It was a sanctum of peace, a place of stillness, an escape from hormonal teenagers. He smiled and allowed himself the luxury to relax. The door flew open with a bang before Scott and Evan marched in. Perhaps march was the wrong word. Cyclops had developed a swagger worthy of the greatest high school jock, and Evan walked so bow-legged it looked like he had just come off a horse with the circumference of a barrel. Very slowly, he lowered his light reading book, which was carefully tucked inside a quantum physics book. It was the best way to avoid explaining why he was reading a romance novel. Howdy, partners. Evan threw himself into a seat with a big grin on his face. Yo! Very carefully, Scott dropped into a seat and then jumped up as if he had been scalded. Rattler bit you? I think my trousers just gave me a wedgie. There was a pause before Evan burst out laughing. Yeah, well, what would John Travolta and Grease do? I challenge you to a fight. Well, mate, this town ain't big enough for the both of us. Guns and sunset. With that, Evan got to his feet and very painfully shuffled out of the library. Scott, are you feeling alright? Cyclops drew him a dark look. I ain't got no time for feelings, old man. It had to be the gel. There couldn't be any other reason why he said that. Swaggering off quickly, Scott left. The professor put his fingers to his temples. Logan, Aurora, I believe there is something wrong with the students. You got that right, bub. I say we should let this run its course, came Aurora's thoughts. It's peaceful letting them run wild. If you think it's wise. I do. The Weather Witch looked down at her foot warmer, which shifted minutely so it could spot the ball of wool. Isn't that right, Chip? Meow? Can you spare? No, I can't. Rabbits don't have pockets to carry money in. Rogue! Jean burst out laughing. You look ridiculous. You can hardly talk. Haven't you seen a mirror lately? Jane frowned. You do know you weren't allowed to talk. Squeak. Oddly enough, that sounded like the foulest thing anyone could ever say. The goth smiled smugly and skipped away down the corridor where she slipped into the living room and saw Aurora knitting. We have a pet rabbit too now, do we? The Weather Witch smiled. I hope Chip here doesn't like chasing rabbits like he does chasing my wool. Rogue very slowly looked at the sprawled out form of Kurt, who grinned at her lazily. She nearly had a heart attack for a split second until she realized he was wearing shorts. Squeak! Meow! He shrugged and then yawned, getting to his 4 feet lazily with an authentic-looking cat stretch. Meow! How sweet. He's asking if you want some lunch. Rogue grinned and nodded before following Kurt down the corridor. She could almost have sworn that she heard Aurora burst out laughing. But that was impossible. The Weather Witch was always so calm and serious. The pair paused as they entered the kitchen, and all thoughts of Kurt's ease at walking on his hands and feet flew from the rabbit's mind and the sight. Evan was pinned against the table with 3 adamantium claws only inches from his face. This was interesting. Do you think you're being funny, bub? Evan broke into a cold sweat. I'm sure we could talk over this like civilized gentlemen, partner. I'll partner you. I'm a Canadian, not a cowboy. Rogue quickly shoved the blue mutant forward, and Kurt stumbled in on his force. Casting a dark, feline glare, he looked over and smiled, brushing up against the man and purring before nimbly jumping onto the table. All eyes were on him. Kurt meowed and jiggly grinned before tipping over a bowl, sniffing about for some food. He'd never seen a cat prepare lunch, so he certainly wasn't. Well, looky here, kitty cat. The cowboy grinned, then groaned when he hit the floor after being dropped. Logan decided to pick the cat up instead and glare very coldly at Kurt. He was surprised when the blue mutant twisted and made himself comfortable over his shoulders. Meow? Kurt looked pointedly at the food. Compelled, the adamantium-clawed mutant went to the cupboard and pulled out some bread and ham, which he made into a sandwich and then handed to Kurt. It was gobbled up in minutes, and the blue mutant started to purr. Rogue, why are you dressed up like a rabbit? And Evan, you better have a good excuse to be in your shoes right now. I don't know what you're talking about, partner. Spike gulped and edged back against the wall. Squeak! Rogue cursed and then glared at everyone before taking some food and leaving with another cursing squeak over her shoulder. The cowboy also quickly departed. So, Fangs, what am I gonna do with an oversized blue cat? Logan was smiling darkly. With a gulp, Kurt let out a very careful and pathetic "You're right. A nice little run in the danger room will do you good. Well, thanks." Scott stared at Jean. Jean stared at Scott. Both felt extremely stupid and in desperate need of at least an hour in the bathroom before ever being seen again. They also both felt like killing Evan. Unfortunately, the cowboy was failing to make an appearance and be killed for the liking, so they settled for the next best thing. Coded role speech. "Have you got any change?" "I wouldn't give change to a worthless tramp." Scott smiled softly at her. Jean sighed miserably. "I hate this. It's your life, not mine, and I'm glad of it." Did that come out too harsh? It was definitely the hair job. "Seen anything interesting?" "A dog, a rabbit, a cat, a cowboy, and a tramp." "You?" "Pretty much the same, except there's also a really bad Fonz impersonator." "I was thinking more grease lightning." He pointed in opposite directions and then cleared his throat, letting his arms drop again. "You wouldn't know any decent burger bars, would you?" "Got any change?" "I thought not." He sighed and went away, leaving the love of his life looking like an idiot. Well, he didn't look like an idiot. He stopped in front of the mirror and winked at it as he pointed to his reflection. The trousers crept up again. Very carefully, Kitty crept into the living room and fell over a ball of wool, which looked as if it had been suspiciously pawed around. That meant that Kurt must be nearby, and if he was nearby, then she could finally chase and annoy him. Perhaps things were finally looking up. "A dog, too. I hope you don't chase Chip or Floppy around. Now, what shall I call you? How about Holly?" Kitty cringed. "Woof!" "No, you're not getting on the furniture. The rug is perfectly comfortable." With a growl, Kitty stormed out of the room and into the professor. "Woof!" She smiled nervously, then sunk through the floor. Charles wheeled himself into the living room and settled next to Aurora. Neither said anything for a long time, but it was the professor that decided to break it. "Do you think this is permanent?" "They'll be back to normal by dinner." "Are you sure?" The weather witch nodded. "I am positive, Charles, though some of their changes may be for the better." "I only hope you're right." "As do I." Kurt leapt over the swirling blades and then clung onto the wall as it started to move towards another wall. He took one look and then threw himself as fast and as far as he could up and only just avoided being squished. The blue mutant took a deep breath before bouncing away from the sharp-bladed claws swung at his head. "Stay still, you cat!" Kurt hissed and ran on again. Cats were notoriously contrary after all, and he didn't much fancy his chances as a cat against Wolverine. He didn't fancy his chances as Nightcrawler against Wolverine. The other mutant snarled and lashed at Kurt. "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty. Come on, Fangs, I've got some fish for you." He snorted. "Wow!" Then slunk off as fast as he could. There had been a cat back in Germany who greeted everyone at the door by dropping on their heads from the door frame. Kurt decided to try it. "Ah!" In his mad flaying about, Wolverine stumbled and then continued to roll Kurt free into the swirling blades. The feline turned around and covered his eyes at the screams and curses sent his way. Today was indeed not going to get any better. This was ridiculous. She was eating rabbit food. The carrots were tossed aside and Rogue picked up the lettuce. Only one thought made her smile. Little Miss Vegetarian would have some real problems in the food department. Cackling, she stretched and knocked her ears off. Picking them up and making sure that they were secure, she inwardly groaned when the professor wheeled in. The man paused, made an arch with his fingers, and actually smiled. "Rogue, may I ask what's happening?" The god smirked. "Squeak!" She batted her eyes and picked up another bit of lettuce. The professor came over and also took a bit, possibly checking if there was alcohol sprinkled on it. Finding none, he frowned. "Whatever you are playing at, it has to end now. Do you understand me?" Squeak! Somehow she still had that southern accent. "Who is behind this? Kurt? Evan? Magneto? Apocalypse?" This was interesting. "Squeak!" she confirmed. Charles was seriously considering entering the young girl's mind and to just find out what was behind this madness, stuffing his code of ethics. And just then, Jean entered. "Can you spare any change?" She held her hand out. Rogue dumped a bit of carrot in it, then skipped out of the kitchen. "Change?" "Jean is my truest confidant. What is happening?" "I don't do drugs. I'm not an alcoholic. I'm just having a rough time. Can you please spare me some change?" This was ridiculous. Wheeling with all his might, Charles Xavier, head of the X-Men and the most powerful telepath in the world, decided to get some of his hidden stash of Twinkies. Shrugging, Jean left. Exhausted, Kurt dropped down in a sweaty bundle of fur. He wouldn't be able to last another round, not even one more. Logan picked up the feline and slung him over his shoulder as he swaggered out of the danger room. "You know, Fangs, I think you should keep up the cat antics when you battle in the danger room." Meow? Kurt smiled and was dropped onto the table in the kitchen, where he watched Logan take out 2 beers from the fridge. The Canadian paused after puncturing them both open. Smirking, he removed a bowl from the cupboard. "Here you go, Fang." The beer was poured into it, and Logan grinned. This was a real test. If this was just a game, then the Blue Mutant would have to crack. Meow! Kurt sat up and lapped from the bowl, pausing to wrinkle his nose. American beer, ugh! Where was the good old European stuff he knew Logan hid? Very carefully, Wolverine looked at the bowl, which was promptly turned over into the sink, and then at the annoyed Blue Mutant. "Ah, you want the good stuff. I guess you've earned it, Fang." Kurt smirked and settled down as he was given a bowl of the good stuff. "Now, on your technique, you need to be more aware of what's happening in the entire room, not just my claws." The cowboy brushed his boots down again and sighed in boredom. This game had turned out a lot less fun than he'd hoped it would have. Perhaps that duel with Scott would make things more interesting, and certainly dinner would be a laugh. He paused and looked at Kitty, who looked at him coldly. She turned and looked at the wall instead. "Come on, Kitty, don't do this to me." She continued to look at the wall. Evan sighed and walked over to her. "Come on, I'm hating this too. I can't even be within a 20-meter radius of Logan, or else he'll try and kill me. Scott is too happy acting like a brat, and Rogue is having great fun scaring everyone and being as rude as she wants. Jane's about the only good thing about this." "Yeah, but I still hate you." She clammed her hands over her mouth. "I can't believe I just, talked." "Huh?" "We have to, stay in character." Kitty rolled her eyes. "You won't tell, will you?" Evan shrugged. "Don't worry, I was just out of character, and Scott keeps wavering. It's only Jean, Rogue, and Kitty left, really." He shrugged again. "But we have to still keep it up." "What's the, prize, anyway?" He grinned and pretended to pull a zip over his mouth. She growled and stormed off angrily, running into Rogue as she did so. Squeak! Woof! Kitty grinned very slowly. Woof! Oh no, the goth turned and took off as Kitty gave chase. This wasn't supposed to be happening. This wasn't fun! And the use of acrobatics is a good idea to incorporate into your fighting techniques. Throws the enemy off balance. Kurt meowed and pawed at the beer bottle. He was poured his third for the night so far into the bowl. This was getting annoying. Scott had to admit, though, there was a certain thing he liked about being able to act like a normal if somewhat outdated teenager for a bit. But the bad-mouthing was taking some time to get used to. He paused, glancing into the kitchen, only to hear Logan rabbiting on about something or other with an amused Kurt watching him. And speaking of rabbits, instantly Cyclops clapped his hands together. The chance for revenge against the sarcastic goth was too much, and he swaggered past to startle Aurora. I think I preferred Kurt over him, even before he went all cat on us, she sighed. Professor Xavier was getting worried. Evan's knowledge of Westerns was extensive and mind-boggling. This had to be Magneto's doing. What sort of a telepath was strong enough to pull off a stunt like that? The answer had yet to reveal itself, and he cautiously wheeled past the cowboy, sighing when he was noticed again. Well, howdy, Evan grinned. How about me and you go down to the salon to get us a good drink? Milk is the strongest I'm allowing you, Evan, and not too much. Storm is about to make dinner for us all. The Weather Witch has successfully managed to chase everyone out of the kitchen, apart from Kurt, who she let doze lightly upside down from the ceiling fixture. She was quite happily talking to him, as she did to the plants, which was about nothing and everything. But I'm also worried about this new behavior in Scott. He was so dependable before. Perhaps too dependable. Meow? I may have pushed him too far. Perhaps I pushed them all too far, Chip. Kurt shook his head. Meow! He told her very firmly. Perhaps. She passed him another bit of sausage, which was eaten readily. Now, why did Logan call you Fangs, I wonder? I hope he hasn't had the audacity to name you. The blue mutant decided to remain silent on that particular comment as he dropped down onto the table, guiltily stepping over the missed beer bottle. He jumped into one of the seats and meowed happily, putting his heads on the table. It's not ready yet, Chip. Aurora smiled. Well, I guess one little bite won't hurt. She ruffled his hair and absently scratched him behind the ear. Kurt was going to have words with Aurora about this after the day was through, though he wasn't going to complain if she decided to let him keep the cat privileges. As if on some silent cue, a prompting by the professor most likely, all the teenagers and adults entered the kitchen and sat at their usual places, looking slightly the worse for wear. The blue mutant quite smugly meowed loudly and pawed his bowl. Fangs wants another beer. Logan got to his feet. Chip wants some more cream. Aurora got to her feet. They looked at each other coolly for a moment before sitting back down at their seats and started to eat their own meals. Rogue poked the carrots and lettuce on her plate for a moment, then snapped. I can't eat this, I quit. She pulled the rabbit ears off and took the plate that Kitty had been staring at full of meat. Yeah, I totally give in. Kitty rubbed the black off her nose and pulled off her black jumper, revealing a bright pink top. Finally, back to normality. The professor looked at them carefully. Are you both feeling alright? Yeah, but I don't want to even know how much of a fool I made of myself. Rogue shook her head and started to apply her black eyeliner happily. I don't even want to think about it. Kitty shook her own head and tucked into the vegetarian feast on offer. When are you guys gonna snap out of it too? Scott grinned. Now. He tousled his hair and removed the black jacket. How do you girls go about with so much gunk in your hair? He shied back from the glares. Evan and Kurt glanced at one another. The blue mutant readily lapped up the beer on offer, waiting for the cowboy to crack. It happened all too soon. Even a mountain would have cracked under Logan's scowl. He blushed. It was my idea because I won earlier, and so he took the sheriff badge off. It wasn't my idea to be a cowboy. Slowly, everyone looked over to Kurt and Jean. An idea came to Kurt and he decided to actively use it. He started to groom himself with the expertise of cats everywhere. His blue hair was first. Jean bit her lip and pressed her nails into her palm. After a moment, her left eye twitched. It took one more brush before she leapt to her feet and ran out of the room shouting, I need my hairbrush! Sighing, Evan was about to say something, but Rogue stopped him with an evil grin on her now dark-eyed face. He has to stay as a cat until 10 tonight as agreed. It's not fair! Rogue finally gave in, trying to annoy and embarrass Kurt. At the moment, he was lying lethargically on his back as he toyed with Aurora's wool and half-watched the Saturday night film. He looked up and purred with a grin. Let me try. Kitty moved over and tugged his tail. There was a violent hiss, and she was kicked over backwards by one of his cat-like feet. With another hiss, Kurt moved himself onto the seat between Aurora and Logan, which was designated as detention when watching movies. If you so much as sneezed, a ton of bricks falling on you was preferable. Ha! Evan laughed, then watched in disbelief as Kurt made himself quite comfortable over Aurora and Logan. This isn't fair! The Canadian smiled. Looks like Fang's here to stay for the film. I think Chip would prefer it if you didn't smoke over him. The smell gets in his fur. Kurt very cautiously started to edge to the side of the couch where he'd be able to flee at a moment's notice. Hopefully that would be the moment before electricity and adamantium claws were involved. I don't think you'll mind this little smoke. It's less intoxicating than your perfume, and that would cling to him for weeks. My perfume? Have you even smelled your cologne? I'm amazed it hasn't impaired that marvelous sense of smell you're always on about. Impaired? The only thing being impaired is my ears from your constant nagging. My nagging? At least I'm not acting like some Neanderthal barbarian with less than average brain cells. By this point, every X-Man and the professor had left the two adults in the room to argue on in peace. The place of choice to rest was the library, which was not a great idea for a bunch of bored teenagers trying to entertain themselves. Half an hour had passed, and it still wasn't safe to flee the library. There was serious talk about battening down the hatches and setting books alight to keep them warm. Rogue was sighing to herself and cursing the color white. "This is stupid!" She looked about herself and stopped at the sight of Kitty, happily stroking Kurt's back as he lounged on the floor. "Kitty!" "Huh? Oh, Kurt!" She pushed him, and with a hiss, he got to his feet and wandered the meter and a half to sit next to Rogue. The goth wondered if she should annoy him, or, since there was only 10 minutes left, just leave him be. She settled on stealing his warmth. Evan noticed this and decided to take it upon himself for Kurt not to win the prize, which by default would then be given to him. Now, how to do this? It was going to be a long 5 minutes, Kurt decided to himself as he hid under the professor's wheelchair. A spike landed a few feet from his blue tail, and the mutant seriously considered that perhaps the prize wasn't worth the bother. But then why would everyone be going to such lengths to stop him winning it? With a hiss, Kurt took off and smashed into Evan before flipping into Cyclops and using the momentum to land on the stack of bookcases. He now had to just keep watch for them from here. Now, what had Logan said? He was pretty sure it was mentioned between the first and second beer. Or was it the third? The blue mutant grabbed hold of the wood as Jean tried to telepathically lift him up after a moment of wrestling. He was dropped and fell ungracefully into Kitty, who screamed. Why does she always scream? It really annoyed him. With a hiss, he slunk into the shadows and let them swallow his dark form whole. It took seconds for their angry curses to reach his ears. The professor watched in interest as his pupils used their abilities in a desperate bid to find their feline acting comrade, who was happily sprawled next to the wheelchair. You know, I don't think these sorts of games are wise. Meow. I understand that it's nice to act like normal humans, or a cat in your case, but you have to understand that it isn't always as safe as it should be. The man sighed and watched his students start to argue about where Kurt was hiding. But I'd have at least liked to have been informed. A small beeping sound started from Kurt's watch, and the blue mutant jumped to his feet with a cheer. Wunderbar! I won! He started to do a small victory dance. The other teenagers dragged themselves over to Kurt and the professor. Jean decided to ask everyone's question. Evan, what was the prize? To decide what to do for the night's danger section. Oh, that'll be a piece of cake then.